All right, we're 2 minutes in. Want to be respectful of everyone's time, so welcome everyone. I'm Alton Dillard. I'm a communications advisor for the elections group. I'm also a former U.S. Senate press secretary, and I worked 17 years Denver County, Colorado, as the communications manager at the Denver Clerk and Recorder. Thank you for joining us for this conversation titled "Shit Happens." It does. And one of the things we're going to do today is just talk about all the various things that can be done and various techniques and tactics. And we're fortunate to have with us today two outstanding professionals. So, gentlemen, can you introduce yourselves? I'm going to start with you, Omar.
Great. Thank you, Alton. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Omar Parbu. I'm the Managing Director for Civic Engagement at Ideas 42, which I'll explain a little bit more about later, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, thanks, Omar and Alton. My name is Noah Prates, president and co-founder of the elections group. For 20 years, I ran elections in Cook County, Illinois. Looking back, we had a lot of good times, a lot of bad times, a lot of wins, and a lot of mistakes. I've forgotten most of the wins. Every one of those mistakes I wear like a scar, and I'm looking forward to the sort of comms expertise to think about how I could have helped in advance and recovered quicker. Thanks, Alton.
Sure thing. And today we're going to hear from pretty much everybody. We're going to start with Noah and I. We're going to talk about some context. And then Omar is going to share some interesting insights on how both election officials and their constituents respond when things don't go well. And they're also going to talk about some of the tools they use. And then we will follow up with tips for reacting when shit hits the fan. We'll be pulling directly from some resources that are provided by the elections group. Couple things. A, please put your questions in the chat, but also whenever things happen, whenever shit hits the fan, we always made sure in my old jurisdiction that you were never in a posture of pointing fingers at other jurisdictions or making light of another jurisdiction's issues. It was just simply a teachable learning moment. So in addition to questions, if there's anything that you want to do to kind of rat yourselves out a little bit about a mistake that you made or witnessed, we can also do that at the end. All righty. So again, that's the context for what we're going to do. So we're going to hop into the presentation here. And why don't you start us off, Noah?
Yeah, well, I mean, Alton, as you can see, like there are a ton of examples from every newspaper, every election line that we read every morning of little things that happen, misprints, sort of ballot errors, mailing issues, late openings. These things don't get the same grace as when other shit happens, acts of God, right? Weather, pandemics, fires, floods. It's baked into sort of the American psyche that services will be disrupted or not needed. They don't have necessarily the same grace for us when there are sort of mistakes that hopefully could have been prevented. I'll talk through a couple of mine later. It's pretty tough. You know, these things can really get blown out of proportion. In my neighborhood back in 2010, there was a Green Party candidate for governor who got the most and best free press of his entire life. And, you know, he loved it. He said, you know, after voters found out that the review screen, you know, his name was Rich Whitney, but the review screen said Rich Whitey. And he said, man, you know, that's great free press in the Wall Street Journal. That's great free press in the New York Times. My name ID went way up, but that is not how I want to come across to many of the voters in certain parts of the city and in Cook County. You know, and we wear those things as scars. They happen. We got ballots with thousands of candidates. I've certainly goofed up a bunch of them over the years. Now, Alton, our worst cases, I think we had the same worst day, right? 2006.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about what happened to you guys.
Oh boy. In 2006 in Denver County, back when we were still under a commission structure, which consisted of two elected elections commissioner and appointed clerk and recorder, we essentially had a tech failure in our move to e-poll books that resulted in 20,000 people getting turned away without voting. I'm talking about helicopters up showing the lines outside the vote centers. And this also predates our current Colorado model where we mail ballots to all voters. So we did have a vote center model. And it was one of those things where it was a tech issue. So one of the things we'll talk about during the course of our discussion here is making sure that you have redundancies in place, not only technical redundancies, but human redundancies. So essentially what happened was the poll book, which was created in-house, was set up in a way where sessions did not expire unless the election judge manually did it. And the thing essentially just crumped under its own weight. So I was a contract spokesperson at the time. Polls opened at 7. My phone's ringing at 7:15 that something is going wrong because we're starting to see long lines. And it's like, how can you have lines at 7:15? And so between that, and then there was also a ballot programming error where you could not just take a batch of ballots and feed it into the scanner. So we had to manually separate every ballot style. So we literally, between the people who had to stand in line all day and the folks, including candidates and issue campaigns, that did not get their results for weeks afterward. That's one of the reasons I like to joke that gray hair notwithstanding, I'm only about 22 years old because I work in elections. So that was one doozy. And what about yourself, Noah?
Yeah, I mean, sort of similar story. We got rid of punch cards right after the Help America Vote Act. 2006 was first election in the primary, and man, everything you could think of went wrong. Like the ballot stubs not tearing, jamming scanners, the ballot design was rough. We managed to limp through most of the day. At the end of the night, we started transmitting results, and the network sort of wasn't tuned for the new packet size. Our manual backups were too slow. The papers were like, Noah, David Orr, you have one job to put out the election results. And it took us many days to get there. Lots of operational mistakes, tech stakes. We tried to get ahead of it, put together a blue ribbon panel. That panel sort of had a pretty scathing report for us. And so internally, between the general and the election, we built in all kinds of operational redundancies, contingency plans for when shit happens and you got to go to plan B. But on the comms side, our messaging was basically, don't worry, we learned our lessons, we got this. So come November, bam, additional mistakes, right? We're corrupted results cartridges. In my rush to do my one job and put out election results fast, I failed to proof a report that went public. Wildly crazy results. A candidate got an extra like 150,000 votes for one cartridge. Pulled it down, but honest mistake, correctable, not actually undermining the actual election, but confidence in the election went way down. And so like the lesson that I learned from there was I got to work with all my stakeholders to set appropriate expectations, build those relationships, build a capacity of trust that I could rely upon when little things like that do happen. So I can't wait to hear more from Omar in a little bit. So as we think about like looking at 24, you got election officials, voters, campaigns, the media, observers, all of them needing to sort of understand intuitively that kind of poop happens. Shit always happens, and it will again in 24. Elections are very complex. Okay. In 24, the field is less experienced due to a massive turnover. The pressure for perfection is tight, right? The spotlight is bright. And so I think we all as a community got to expect that every little honest and correctable issue will be magnified and sometimes strung together like it was in 20, creating very, damaging meta narratives. And so my dream headline, coming out of 24 is that shit happens, but when it does, there's a contingency plan for it. So it's baked in to everybody's understanding that even if you're using plan B, that's part of the plan. This is still secure. There's still integrity. We apologize we didn't meet the service level expectations, but the results are trustworthy and true. It's tough, right? Elections are so complex, massive election day operations, early voting everywhere, mail voting on the increase. And it's tough for kind of those well-meaning observers that, you could sit there in a bipartisan team and monitor each of these activities individually, but stringing it all together to understand like all the integrity controls is pretty tough. So we come at this with a lot of sensitivities for our observers, for people that might be a bit skeptical. So, on top of the complexity, a skeptical public, there's a crazy information environment out there, threats of like generative AI and what that might do. So in 24, while voters, some are deeply distrustful, our election is going to be observed, which is awesome and necessary to the integrity of it, but it's going to be scrutinized like never before. And we should expect that those little mistakes, rather than being easy to tamp down, may require sort of crisis response in the minds of many. And so, as one of our friends, a local election official said, one small mistake, honest, has ripple effects. It's gotten to the point where there's zero tolerance for errors, and they all live with that pressure. So anyway, if 2020 was that results were going to be slower, 2024 is shit happens. And I don't mean this like a pejorative, Alden. We work our tails off to get this exactly right, where every mistake is like a scar. But we are human. We rely on other humans and technologies. Elections are complex, less experienced field. The pressure's immense. The spotlight's bright. And these issues will be magnified. So I can't wait to hear about Omar talk us through, how we build up a capacity or a fountain of trust with our stakeholders, sort of in advance elections, and then to come back, Alden, and squeeze your brain about, how you respond when it is a crisis.
That's a good segue. So why don't you go ahead and take it away from here, Omar? But I really also, one of the themes that I'm hearing just in listening to both you gentlemen and knowing your experience is the importance of, essentially, it's a term we use in sports, that if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. So Omar, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, I love that expression, Alton. And let me just say thank you to both you and Noah for going through all those examples. It can feel very vulnerable to run through your mistakes that way, but it's extremely valuable to talk through how commonplace it is and how it's manageable nonetheless. So I mentioned that I work for an organization called Ideas 42, and just to quickly preview what my portion of today's webinar is going to be about, I want to talk about a few ways to think about proactively mitigating the impact of mistakes. I'll share some insights on how to build trust and confidence with the public, and then present concrete ways that Ideas 42, working closely with partners like the Elections Group, is directly supporting election officials throughout the process. But first, what is Ideas 42? I know our name is a bit nondescript, but we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that uses insights from psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience to design solutions for good. I like to think of us as a bridge between academia and the real world. We conduct a lot of research and lean heavily on our academic partners, but our main focus is on translating insights into practical solutions at scale. So on the next slide, our civic engagement practice, sorry, one slide before, please. Our civic engagement practice in particular focuses on voting in the US and how we can make participation easier and more accessible for all voters, again, with a strong nonpartisan lens. In many ways, we have our work cut out for us. Voting is often an infrequent act, so it's hard for people to build knowledge and habits. And voting is also a journey, from registration to knowing what's on your ballot to actually casting a ballot. And people can easily get tripped up at any point on that journey. But we can do things to address these challenges. And that's what our civic engagement team thinks about every day. We conduct research and experiments to uncover the barriers that voters face and design evidence-based solutions to remove those barriers. But like you, we're just trying to figure out how we can best support voters. But of course, key to that goal is supporting election officials as well. So next slide, please. With that in mind, let's talk about a central reality of life. Everyone makes mistakes. As Noah said, we're all human. Sometimes we feel a bit like Steve Urkel and we're taken aback by our errors. But I like this quote from Nobel Prize winning physicist Niels Bohr, who recognized the inevitability of mistakes in our work. He wrote, an expert is a person who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a very, very narrow field. But while mistakes can usually be rectified and are nearly always instructive, in the election space, they can easily be turned into fodder for bad faith actors. That puts a lot of pressure on election officials, worrying that a mistake may become the next conspiracy theory. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we understand and anticipate how people take in information about mistakes, we can take the steps to ensure people give more slack and don't spiral into conspiratorial thinking. Imagine you have a colleague who is a star performer and always conscientious. One day she forgets to show up for a meeting. You'd likely tell her it's no big deal and that it happens to the best of us. But imagine that same scenario with someone who you've heard is habitually careless. Your reaction will probably be a lot less forgiving. But the good news is that election officials are typically star performers. We just need the public to understand that. So we can go to the next slide, please. I want to share some research by an academic named Gordon Pennycook. Gordon is an academic who's very focused on how mis and disinformation spreads, and he recently released a useful model for how our brains reason when we receive information. So this model helps us unpack how people form their reactions to mistakes. So to quickly summarize, when someone hears about something going wrong, their intuition kicks in to produce a set of initial responses, which are likely negative. If everything in their intuition aligns with that negative view, they will form an instinctive reaction. If, however, they have a contradictory intuition about the mistake, then their brain kicks into more deliberate thinking. So I want to give an example to spell that out a little bit more. When people see a social media post purporting that ballots were mishandled, their initial reaction will be tied to core beliefs that they hold. They may instinctively think that someone did something bad, unless they also hold the belief that ballots are usually handled securely and with extreme care. In that case, because the post doesn't pass the quote-unquote sniff test, more deliberate reasoning kicks in. Now, a deliberate reaction doesn't always mean the right reaction, so we need to give people sufficient information for them to form proper instincts and reach accurate conclusions. You can go to the next slide, please. Specifically, we can help shape people's understanding of elections through effective communication. And more to the point, communication from election officials like you. I know it can feel daunting, but the good news is that you have an authoritative voice, and local election officials are consistently cited as the most trusted source on elections. So outreach from you can change public perceptions. And just the act of being visible to the public builds familiarity and trust. Our brains are wired to like things that are familiar to us. So repeated exposure can truly help change someone's impression of you. If you communicate directly and often with the public, you can shape beliefs and perceptions so that when mistakes do happen, they're received well and not blown out of proportion. Next slide, please. I can't stress enough the power of proactive communication. The combination of you as a trusted messenger setting out effective messages engenders trust and confidence. This will help improve confidence in our democracy, but also create more slack for you if a mistake does happen. So how do you communicate effectively? Let me share some high-level tips that you can use as you think through your communication strategy. And to tip my hand a little bit, I'll also be sharing a tool at the end that we created to make it extremely easy to use these best practices in all of your outreach. So first, on the next slide, it's important to set the right tone. Make sure the public views hearing from you as a moment to receive useful information and not a sign that something is wrong. If the first they hear from you is a moment of crisis, then the negative association is set. Instead, you can form the right impressions by being intentional about what information you deliver, how consistently you deliver it, and the style in which you communicate. By giving voters a lot of useful information about elections and how they can participate, you're demonstrating your credibility as the definitive source of good information. And by being consistent, you're reinforcing correct narratives over false ones. And lastly, by focusing on process and the day-to-day details of voting, people will see that you're delivering a service and not advancing some agenda. But all of this has to be done proactively and not reactively. It's much easier to set a first impression rather than walking one back. In concrete terms, we recommend oversharing notifications about upcoming elections, deadlines, how and where to cast a ballot, etc. So on the next slide, coupled with setting the right tone is being visible. People need to see your outreach to benefit from it. So to that end, it's important to understand that voters get their information from different sources. So using multiple channels to get the same message out will help you widen and deepen your outreach. If possible, post on different social media sites and use print materials to get your most important messages out. And I know it's not feasible for all of you, but if possible, email and SMS can be incredibly effective at reaching and grabbing the attention of wider audiences. However, no matter what channels you use, having a consistent visual identity can make your messages stand out and help voters instinctively recognize your content. This means using consistent colors, images, and language. And if you have an office seal or logo, please make sure to put that on all of your outreach. Just think about logos and fonts and colors for some of your favorite brands. You can almost recognize that brand without having to read anything. And you want voters to feel the same way about your outreach. And finally, timing is everything. If the information doesn't feel relevant, people will ignore it. We have a way of quickly triaging information and cutting out things that aren't useful or resonant. So only deliver information that is meaningful to people in that moment. I know it can be tempting to preview all the voting steps or all the deadlines at one time, but except in rare cases, that approach can ultimately backfire. So lastly, it's important to stay transparent. Bad faith actors are able to control the narrative when voters don't have a clear sense of what's really happening. When mistakes are made, you should be the one describing what happened, what it means, and how it's being remedied. Otherwise, someone else will take on that mantle and potentially distort the truth. But if despite your best efforts, a false narrative does get out there, it's best to focus on your story and not try to directly dispute or debunk the falsehoods, because doing so can potentially reinforce or amplify that wrong message. But being transparent is something that we can also do proactively. Educate voters on the safeguards that are in place and share easy to digest explanations of how ballots are processed and counted. A recent study that Issue 1 commissioned with Citizen Data showed that messages around the certification process, so that explains the certification period after an election, resulted in a statistically significant increase in election trust among people they surveyed. Now, this type of education can be pushed out, but it's also good to anticipate questions and put related answers in FAQs that people can easily find independently. So that's a lot of information, a lot of tips. But on the next slide, I want to just acknowledge that I gave you basically a laundry list of things to keep in mind. But we and others like the elections group have created tools to make these insights easy to use. We have several guides on our website, ideas42.org, about effective communication, checklists on how to communicate well, addressing mis and disinformation, and others. But I'm particularly excited to share a new tool we developed to streamline voter outreach for every election official around the country. While guides have their place, one piece of feedback we've received is that even with sample language and sample visuals, offices don't always have the bandwidth to create a ton of outreach materials, which is basically what I'm asking y'all to do to get out ahead of mistakes. So over the past 3 years, we've been building a technology to help close that gap. On the next slide, please. I'm happy to say that last fall, we launched the full version of that technology called VoterCast. So VoterCast takes the guesswork and effort out of creating materials by using evidence-based templates, coupling those templates with data from every local jurisdiction, and offering users off-the-shelf materials that are ready to be deployed in just a few clicks. This enables you to amplify the best practices we just discussed to communicate with voters more consistently and effectively, and to build a base of trust and confidence in our elections and in your office. Ultimately, this will hopefully give you the slack you need if and when mistakes happen. Now, I should say that the content in VoterCast is built around a wealth of research on how to effectively communicate with people and support voters to take particular actions, like updating their registration or signing up for ballot tracking. And all of the best practices are in one place so that it's simple for people to access it in a easy to use online platform. One of our users said that she used to spend 8 hours a week creating materials, and now she's able to do it in one afternoon. So understanding that effective communication requires a lot of effort, hopefully something like this will help streamline the process for election officials. If you can go to the next slide, I just want to be, oh, sorry, I think you already went to the next slide. You can go back up. So I just want to give you a deeper look into how this actually works. So we commissioned a firm to create professional designs, like the one you see here on the left, that follow the behavioral principles of effective communication. And then those designs have placeholder text in them, just like any template would. But as a user, you'll never see the placeholder text. VoterCast automatically fills in the information with data from our data set that includes election and jurisdiction level information on every jurisdiction around the country. And the result is what you see here on the right, content that is automatically tailored to a specific jurisdiction and election. And of course, all of you can edit the designs. It presents something that's off the shelf ready, but you can go into the platform and change the text, change the colors, move things around, make the designs your own as you see fit. And if you have county colors, for example, you can put those into your profile and every piece of content will reflect those colors. Next slide, please. So we built VoterCast with election officials front of mind. We don't want to add another burden on your plate and increase the likelihood of mistakes. So we made the platform extremely easy to use and navigate, because who has time to learn a new technology? You can go to your dashboard and choose from a wide range of common voter outreach topics, or use the custom editor to make your own. For example, there are materials on upcoming elections, registration deadlines, ballot requests, early voting, poll worker recruitment, and so on. And all of this goes back to setting the right tone by proactively providing the public with useful election information so that they see you as the definitive and most trustworthy source of relevant information. On the next slide, please. And in line with making sure your outreach is visible, each topic is offered through various channels, which include email, text messages, flyers, different social media outlets, and more. And since the materials have a consistent visual identity within a theme, you can help voters quickly recognize content coming from you. Now, I mentioned themes, so let me talk about that a little bit. We're in the process of adding new visual themes to give users more options to find outreach that best fits them and their voters. All of these themes are professionally designed and incorporate our best practices, but they serve to give our users some variety. Now, in the spirit of being transparent, which means living what I preach here, while the basic version of VoterCast is free to use in states where that's allowed, the additional visual themes are part of VoterCast Pro, since we have to pay for the additional designs. But our goal is to help as many offices as possible. So we made the Pro version as modestly priced as we could, and it should be within reach of every office. But again, if you're able to sign up for the free version, most of what I presented would be available to you. So on the last slide, if a tool like VoterCast feels valuable to you, please sign up for the platform by visiting www.votercast.com. I'm happy to say we already have users who signed up in 17 states, but the platform is available nationwide, so please do check it out. My hope is that VoterCast can help you strengthen your relationship with voters so that they can get the support they need and you can get the slack you deserve in case a mistake happens. Thank you. Alton, over to you.
All right. Thank you again so much, Omar, for sharing. So yeah, we're going to walk through a few, tools and suggestions here. And one of the things we always like to emphasize is there's two things. One, it's not one size fits all, but that's why it's also so important to use resources like Ideas 42 in the elections group, because we understand that you have different jurisdictions with different sizes. So here in Colorado, we've got some jurisdictions, 500,000 voters, 3, 4, 5 comms people. We also have jurisdictions where you have 3 people doing elections, motor vehicle, marriage license, and record keeping. And so that's why it's so important to be able to rely on some of these kinds of tools. So
Hey.
we had a question in the Q&A about, making sure that the information gets shared. And so we will be providing links to the resources that we've discussed. But this is one of the resources that we will be sharing. And it's information from the elections group, and it's essentially a crisis communications guide. Do you have something there, Noah?
Well, I was just going to say, I love how this sets up, because you got like a incident, crisis, perceived or otherwise, but you've got to respond in crisis mode. I mean, Omar's sort of scientific research, data-driven analysis on how you can build a significant amount of trust with those stakeholders in advance just by communicating nuts and bolts, dotting I's, crossing T's. This is when voting is, like, this is what's going on. You need that when things go boom. And then right a boom, there's a different playbook, right? And you can rely on some of the same tools that Omar laid out, but right a boom, you've got a formula on which you're gonna sort of dig into a bit, but you get to rely on all this trust you engendered that Omar talked about. And I think this sets up sort of really, really well for election officials looking at 24.
Yeah, Noah, you also make a really good point in the importance of having external stakeholders. So going back to my 2006 Denver example, we had sort of an external voters advisory group. And of course, because of all the things that were going on, that was like a tribunal. But as the times evolved and as processes improved and changes were made, then the next thing you know, the same people who were, outside the office with the pots of boiling oil were our biggest allies. Because the other thing that's so important about, especially in a crisis, and this is to go back to something Omar mentioned about being that trusted messenger. Because if people only hear from you in time of crisis, then that changes the whole narrative. So keeping that constant stream, that transparent stream going, and then that way, if something does go wrong, it's like, yeah, well, we hear from these people all the time. We know they're legitimate. We know they're trying to get it worked out. So we're going to go through a few slides here, and then we'll dive into some Q&A. So next slide, please. And all right, was there one before that? I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so you can't plan for everything, but you can also create plans and draft communications so they're ready to go. Omar made a good point about this too. You cannot template everything out, but that's why it's so important that the stuff that is templatable you have ready to go. And we'll talk about, as we go through the slides here, some other tools you can put in place so you're not having to do this on the fly. Next slide, please. And there's the crisis communications guide. And again, we'll be sharing that information with the elections officials on the call. Next, please. All right, so during the crisis, and I think Noah kind of touched on this too, one of the things that I always make sure that people understand is that there's a difference between bad press and a crisis. You have to think in terms of something scalable. So yes, mistakes do occur, especially again in a human process like elections. But if you deal with them proactively, it keeps it from spilling into crisis territory. So things that happen like, a QR code misprint that sends you a CAVA ballots back to the voter instead of the elections office, or something like a printing error that results in a small geography of your voters getting an incorrect ballot style. And it's being something that's confined to not even a whole precinct, but maybe an 8-block area within a precinct. You have ways of reaching out to those affected voters proactively to let them know, oops, our bad, here's what we're doing to fix it. Another big principle I always believe in when it comes to that is you also want to dwell in the solution and while acknowledging the problem or the issue. Next slide, please. All righty, so you have internal communication. So instructions to staff, very important. Then also holding statements for staff. Because when you're in the middle of the shed, it's not going to be your phone ringing. It's going to be your frontline staffers. It's going to be your 311, your city switchboard, however your jurisdiction is set up. And it's also very important that you have contact lists for your primary and secondary support teams, and also continuity and emergency procedures, because think about the part that's in your control. You control the elections part of it. You may not control the city library or the recreation center or the water department that has to turn off the water main that flooded your vote center. So that's why it's so important that you have contact with these people, know where they can be found, even if it is 24 hours a day. And then it's also important to have briefing plans in place in case something does go boom. Next slide, please. Externally, holding statements, very important. Holding statements are just simply literally doing a paragraph on any potential contingency with the caveat that they may never have to be used. Because again, like one of the themes you're hearing through this whole discussion is the importance of transparency. But again, not everything requires a full-blown response, but it's important that you have holding statements at the ready to explain little human things that happen. You saw on the first slide examples like ballots being left in a 24-hour box, something like that. You know, again, especially if it's caught before you do your final results, put them in your tally. We'll do better. We'll put a mechanism in place and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. It's as simple as that. But the things that you can anticipate as far as potential things, have them at the ready. Media advisories and news releases. Sometimes people use these terms interchangeably. Media advisories are simply the 5 W's, the who, what, why, where, and when. That's pretty much all those need to contain. News releases are where you tell the broader and longer story. Press conference plans. Press conferences, you want to make sure that if you have to have one, that you've got everything planned out from where you're going to do it, you know, because again, things vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. One of the most fascinating things that I found out hosting tours of media and election officials from other countries was how in certain countries, even countries like the UK, cameras aren't allowed into vote processing areas or polling places. So if you're trying to illustrate that the work is being done, you have to think about that, but you also have to think about light, noise, if people are going to be wandering back and forth. Text messages or emergency alert notifications. And there is a question in the Q&A, Noah, dealing with how do people make sure that text messages are from a legitimate source. So maybe we can chat a bit about how to do that. And then also, as Omar mentioned, social media posts. One thing about social media, and this is no shade on any elected officials, but I've noticed over the years that elected officials sometimes get caught up in the number of followers as opposed to the number of engagements on a social media post. And so I've seen people with small audiences, but by effective use of hashtagging or being part of the election day narrative, are able to grow their audiences, but it may still be just a matter of you may only have 500 followers, but look, this post got hit by 4,000 people. So think in those terms. Next slide, please. You also want to be transparent, but you want to be careful. And again, this is just real world in the context of shit happens, because no one's going to have 100% handle on everything going on. So you have to have an environment that you work in where you're able to go to your subject matter experts, especially if you're going to be the person communicating externally. But it always goes back to the old, political slogan of trust but verify. So make sure you've got all the information before you step out there. And that way you're not trying to pull back bad information while also trying to deal with potential crisis. Focus on the actions you are taking to address the issue. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier about not just dwelling in the problem, dwelling in the issue. You really want to try whenever possible to lead with the solution. It's come to our attention that A, B, or C has happened. We have reached out to the affected voters. We have reached out to our ballot printing vendor. We have reached out to the United States Postal Service to get more information, but we are assuring you that we are on top of whatever the issue is. Try to provide visual aids, and this could be something very simple. So going back to the question that popped through the chat about trying to make sure information comes from a legitimate source. Back when mail was being used, that's how long I've been in the business. Mail used to be used for misinformation. And so we actually had a press conference with the United States Postal Service to show what the official election mail indicia looks like. That comes from a legitimate elections official. And then also, just briefly back on that point, that's why it's so important that as the trusted information source, you have the relationships to make sure that you can just tell your media, your candidates, don't create content. We already have it. Just link to ours. All it takes is one well-meaning candidate getting when your early voting locations open or getting the hours wrong. In my old jurisdiction, our main office was open all day, but the actual vote centers didn't open, say, until 10. But if some well-meaning person makes that one size fits all, then you've got voters showing up at a locked building. So again, visual aids and have your contingency plans in place. And then also, and this is something, Omar, that maybe you can touch upon again, is don't forget to use the tools. But I say that in the context when you're in the crisis and your blood pressure goes up to 220 over 120, sometimes you just go, ah. So it's so important to just be able to train your brain to take that deep cleansing breath. Even that little 5-second pause that I just took felt like an eternity. But that
this slide really reminds me that in all of our efforts to be sort of transparent and out front, we can make a bigger mess for ourselves.
Yes.
If we don't have all the facts. I remember there was this wrestler, Kane, maybe in WWE or something.
Yes, Glenn
He
Jacobs
decided to run for mayor or something, maybe in Tennessee. That night, the election results webpage wasn't working really well, and a story came out about a cyber event or a cyber issue. And that became sort of the story as opposed to, people from around the world coming to find out how Kane did as he ran for local office, right? And so we can't really create more issues for ourselves if you don't just come out and talk about what you know. My website's not working. We're investigating it. What you're doing, I'm pushing election results out through our social media, paper at the front counter, right? And we are investigating what the issue is, but you go right to solution that's problematic. And we see, we see that a lot. So these are good, very good points.
Thank you. And then if we could pop to the next slide, because we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But after the storm passes, and if it's a true storm, it's not going to pass immediately. That's why, again, it's so important that you have your allies in place. But again, back to the transparency. We messed up. We will put processes in place. We should have done this, we should have done that, but the overall umbrella message is that making sure that voters know that the process is safe, that their votes are going to be counted, and they're going to be counted accurately. Because the other thing that's evolved in the time that, I've been around the business is back when we had the days of the old tabulators that looked like 8 tracks and you just plug in a cartridge, instantaneous results, especially in a mail ballot model like we have here in Colorado. It doesn't work that way anymore because you have to stop the process to report out. And so we have it hardwired into our local media market that you're going to get your results at 7 p.m., 8:30, 10, 11:30. And then the other thing is, because the election's not official until almost Thanksgiving, you have to make that decision whether you want to try to ride your election workers all the way through the night, 3, 4, 5 a.m., and whether that introduces an element of risk. And so we even got to the point, it's like we're cutting vote counting at midnight. We're going to let people go home and get some rest, tackle this with fresh brains. If something's close, we'll make sure that we're providing regular updates, even if we'll be reporting results at 10 o'clock on Wednesday and 2 o'clock on Wednesday. Keep that information flowing. Continue to provide the updates, assess your response, and then you also want to get back into the regular proactive communications. So like I was saying off the top, yes, it's nice to be a trusted source when things are going wrong, but you want to be a trusted source at all times, because then that's what shores up when things are going wrong. And then seek positive news stories. You can also seek positive social. At my old place, the story that got the most interest on social media had nothing to do with the administration of elections. It had to do with a colleague getting stuck in an elevator and being rescued by 4 real hunky-looking firefighters. That thing went viral. So there's always opportunities to be able to tell your story. And as you've heard is a theme that we've talked about here at the elections group, that's also how you humanize the process. We're not robots working behind a curtain like Oz. We're not inside a black box. We are human beings. They're grandfathers, uncles, mothers, aunts, you name it. They're the ones who are making this democracy run by giving of their time to keep things going. So if it is safe, and you can also work on different techniques. I know not everyone likes being photographed. I know election judges, especially in today's environment, get a little concerned about that. But even if people don't want to be highlighted as individuals, highlight the work. All righty, next up, what do we have?
Can I ask a real quick question, Alton and Omar? It's sort of drawn from something I saw in the chat, and it's just a broad recognition that even the coolest and most popular of all election officials have maybe 82 followers in their social media, right? They've got sort of a limited capacity to go direct to consumer. At the same time, local media is sort of a fraction of what it once was, despite investments. And so what's the case for making the investment in sort of those communications? I'm assuming on the one hand, when the media does look, or people who are interested in information and they're going to do their own research, then they can find you. They can find your story, your theory of the case. What would you tell the folks that say there's no return on investment in this, or it's pretty low?
I'll start off with that one. I'll kick it over to you, Omar. The thing that I would tell people is they have to be aware of trends in what we consider media. Media is a business. Media, I know there's some people, I'm going to date myself here, who go back to Clark Kent at the Daily Planet, that kind of, green eye shaded kind of thing. Media is a business and they have suffered contraction. A lot of the media we were able to pick up is because we were active on social media. So I would get as much traction from a reporter or an editor or photographer seeing a social media post as I would do issuing press releases or media advisories. What are your thoughts, Omar?
Yeah, no, I think it's such an important question, and I think it's a reality that we have to contend with. But Noah, you brought up the right point here about having the record there if somebody is going to search the social media account. Also, you talked about engagement and not just follows, and that's also important. There's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem here too, where
Yes.
If an account starts creating a lot of useful information and it consistently does so, people will start realizing this is a good follow. And also, once you start having that steady stream of information going out, it's easier to get partners and other people who do have the reach to amplify that content. So having a few choice partners who are picking up on the content that's going out on these more limited accounts, they can share easily, amplify, bring the right information to people. But getting it out there first is an important step before that broader ecosystem is built.
And then also part of the media relations part there is, once the story hits, it's okay to take that link and then you reshare it. And then that way, and we always were, even if it wasn't necessarily a favorable story, thank you, Reporter X, for, helping us spread the word that we are on top of such and such issue. And especially these days, again, with the contraction in the business, with all outlets, whether they're print outlets, radio outlets, television outlets, everyone there is doing 5 jobs for the price of 1. So one of the other things when I'm doing media relations training is talking to people about making sure that you never rely solely on media to tell your story. And that's why both the in-person engagement is so important, along with having a good social presence. Noah.
Well, there's another sort of semi-related question is we try to go direct to consumer, right? So like cut out the media filters or the campaign filters, go direct to voters through email lists. You guys, there were recommendations on texting. In this information environment, including the worries of generative AI, a lot of folks are worried about how do I know this is authentic? This text message I got from my election official or this social media post or this email. To me, I assume you guys, or I wonder if you're of the same mind that we tried never to push information out through a single stream, right? You would imagine I care about my election results, so I'm going to post it on my fancy interactive election results site, but there was also a PDF version that was static on a regular website and a paper at the front counter, and a PDF was attached to the Facebook. So information is coming out across multiple streams so that when people wanted to validate, like, is this real? They would see it across all of our voices. I would imagine there's a similar set of advice that would go around your other communications. Like if you're texting voters information, you would also be putting that out in your press release or on your website such that it can be validated.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from some work we did with the Secretary of State of California back in 2020, where we actually used social media to preview that some emails were coming out with useful information and that they're legitimately being sent from the Secretary of State. And again, that was a way of giving people a heads up that this was accurate. And what actually happens is that people who got the email went to the social media accounts after the fact to say, like, what's going on with this, and potentially ready to post something about it, and then saw the post from the Secretary of State's office that this was coming down the pike. Now that's a lot of work to do. So doing what you just said and having just the communication redundantly stated is important, and some people will go and look for that sort of verification. The other thing that we do in our draft SMS in VoterCast is we don't shorten URLs so that people can see what the link looks like, and it makes for a cumbersome and potentially expensive SMS send, but it helps to ensure that people see the .gov where available or the full URL for the website so that they know that they're clicking on something legitimate.
Yes, and it is important to, echo what you both said, that you are putting out a heads up when any kind of communication is forthcoming. But I also like to say it's not what you say, but how you say it. And here's an example from my old jurisdiction. We essentially created what is now known as modern ballot tracking. And in the interest of transparency, we wanted to make sure that voters knew where their ballot was at every single stretch of the process. So a few years ago, in the interest of trying to be transparent, we were letting voters know that their ballots were being printed. Who's printing my ballot? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Is it some hacker? And it's like, ooh, okay, not the best language. So what we will do going forward is we will let voters know that their ballot is en route to them. And we won't get into the fact that it's coming from the printing plant to the USPS to go out the door. So again, you'd be surprised what people can flash on. But anytime, especially if there was a mailer that was outside of our regular statutory ones, we would provide a heads up, and then again telling people when it came to actual physical mail to keep an eye out for the indicia.
So we're here sort of at the end of time. We use the title "Shit Happens" as, I guess, clickbait. Voters deserve like perfect elections. They've never gotten them. They never will. Like, how do we communicate to them, like, how serious we take sort of every mistake, right? Even though we work to put it in context and minimize it, what we have out there are millions of Americans who care deeply about their democracy, right? And are skeptical for a variety of reasons, right? But we can't answer the question of why. We deal with the consequences of frustrated voters. So how do we let them know we're taking it seriously, even if at the same time sort of trying to minimize their concern, right? How do you not gaslight them?
Well, one way to do that, I think I kind of touched upon it a little earlier, is you just remind people on the front side that it's a human process. You don't say it's a human process and we're going to mess something up. But when you just continue to remind people that this is a human process and you get that out there as much as humanly possible, that way when things do start stirring, that at least is subconsciously on their mind. And then again, to me, the dwelling in the solution as opposed to the problem, and depending on, again, the severity of it, I still think is just another, sort of key point there, that you let people know that you're on it, you're tackling it. And then once you're through it, you discuss the updated procedures, the updated whatever you have to do to make sure they know that you're working to make sure it doesn't happen again. You can't guarantee it, but we're all working towards that utopian goal.
Omar, do you have any closing thoughts? You were the star of today's show with your fantastic tools and your great research.
Well, I appreciate the time and the attention from everybody. I've noticed that a lot of people have been signing up for Broadcast as we speak, so really appreciate that. We take this idea of making sure that people don't misuse outreach and impersonate election officials very seriously. So people who are signing up will see that there's going to be a bit of a delay while we verify they are actually an election official, and I think it's an important step. Just want to say that we will continue to take these kind of insights from people like the elections group and Noah Alton, all that you shared, and other people who are sharing their experiences, and continue to translate those into how we think about producing materials for VoterCast so that it's at everyone's fingertips at all times.
Thanks, Omar. You want to bring us home, Alton?
Yep, just with a reminder, as Omar mentioned, that we will be, providing links to the tools. We'll also provide a link to elections officials to the larger document that talks about how to deal in crisis communications. And again, please reach out to Ideas 42. Please reach out to the elections group. We're in this together, and 2024 is going to be an election year like none other. So rely on each other, reach out, make sure you're keeping your peer relationships up. And there are times when you just have to say, ooh, yeah, we made a doozy. And again, it's okay to share that, because when you're in it together, that's one of the things that builds that bond as elections officials, is being able to be there to celebrate the successes, but also be able to celebrate and how you work through your challenges. Thanks for your time, and have a good rest of your week.